The following is a presentation of VBR. Welcome, and thank you for joining us in our study of God's holy word.
In our video Bible reading of the book of Acts, this is installment number 54, picking up in Acts chapter 17, and we're going to read verses 1 through 9. Acts chapter 17 begins with Paul and Silas having left Philippi under duress. They were asked by the magistrates to leave town, and they went down the road to the city of Thessalonica. And let's notice here, Acts chapter 17, verses 1 through 9. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And Paul went in, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and to rise from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus whom I proclaim to you is the Christ." And some of them were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks, and not a few of the leading women. But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd. And when they could not find them, they dragged Jason and some of the brothers before the city authorities, shouting, "These men who have turned the world upside down have come here also. And Jason has received them, and they're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying that there is another king, Jesus." And the people and the city authorities were disturbed when they heard these things. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. Now, when they had passed through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica. There's no account of them doing anything in those two places. They were perhaps just a place to stop for the night on the road to Thessalonica. The distance that were covered are along a roadway called the Egnatian Way, and that was Rome's major east-west highway, which connected these cities, and it was about 33 miles from Philippi to Amphipolis, which would be a decent day's walk, another 30 miles from Amphipolis to Apollonia, and about 37 miles then from Apollonia to Thessalonica. So it's probable that they walked from city to city day by day, covering a total of about 100 miles from Philippi to Thessalonica in about 3 days' time. Thessalonica was on a major Roman highway, this Egnatian Way, and was the Roman capital of the province of Macedonia. In the first century, when Paul was there, Thessalonica was a good-sized city with a population of over 200,000 people. So it becomes fairly obvious why Thessalonica would be a destination for these men in preaching the gospel. There were a lot of people there, and it was on a good, important highway. While Philippi had not had a Jewish synagogue, Thessalonica did. In fact, it apparently had a significant Jewish synagogue, a significant Jewish population. And so, of course, as was typical, the traveling preachers went there to the synagogue to share the gospel. And Paul went in, verse 2, as was his custom, and on 3 Sabbath days he reasoned with them from the Scriptures, explaining and proving that it was necessary for the Christ to suffer and rise from the dead, and saying, "This Jesus, whom I proclaim to you, is the Christ." Paul reasoned with them. The message of Christ is reasonable. It is founded on facts. It is based on evidence. And it ought to be taught with careful thought and with careful support to persuade the hearers of the truth. I've mentioned different times in the course of the book of Acts when lessons were presented to us in the pages of this narrative that we have several legs of evidence. On some occasions, there was miracles as evidence. On numerous occasions, that also included evidence from the Scriptures, and on several occasions, it included eyewitness testimony. But the gospel was presented on the basis of facts and evidence, and still ought to be presented in such a way today. The word reasoned, when it says that Paul reasoned from the Scriptures, is the same word that Luke used in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verse 45, where Jesus, after his resurrection, appeared to his disciples and explained the Scriptures to them. And in that passage, it says that Jesus opened their minds to understand the Scriptures. Same word is used here to say that Paul reasoned with them from the Scriptures. Paul in Thessalonica was doing what Jesus had done, no doubt using many of the very same scriptures that testified of him. We see here that as with all previous preaching in Acts that was directed toward the Jews, the Old Testament scriptures were a key support for the message of the gospel. The gospel Paul taught, based in the ancient scriptures, centered on the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. That's succinctly stated in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the first several verses, showing that according to the scriptures, which again is a phrase that Paul uses several times in those initial verses of 1 Corinthians 15 regarding the gospel that he preached, that Jesus died according to the scriptures, was buried according to the scriptures, rose again on the third day according to the scriptures. According to the scriptures, that was God's plan for the Christ, the anointed one. And the expectation of the scriptures was fulfilled in Jesus, who is the Christ. That was Paul's message in Thessalonica. It was his message to the Corinthians. It was his message everywhere he preached. Paul may have utilized Psalm 2. Paul may have used Psalm 22, which is about the suffering and the piercing of the hands and the side and the suffering on the cross, or Isaiah 53, the suffering servant, or Zechariah 12:10, Zechariah 13:7, the rejected Messiah. There are any number of scriptures that Paul may have called on to highlight that this had been God's plan from the very beginning. The suffering servant, the rejection of the Christ by the rulers of Israel, the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. Luke notes here that the reasoning in the synagogue took place over a period of 3 Sabbath days. So they had been doing this for a period of something over 2 weeks of meeting with the Jews and discussing the scriptures with them. The time in Thessalonica, though, exceeded those few weeks by some considerable amount. We don't know how long, but certainly more than 2 or 3 weeks. 1 Thessalonians was written shortly after this. We'll see that in an upcoming lesson. But 1 Thessalonians was written shortly after this, just a matter of months later, after Paul had left Thessalonica. And in that letter, he indicated that they had spent some time in the city and built a strong relationship with the brethren. 1 Thessalonians 2:9, Paul, Silas, and Timothy wrote, "For you remember, brothers, our labor and toil. We work night and day that we might not be a burden to any of you while we proclaim to you the gospel of God." So the preachers writing to the congregation some months later said, "You know how we worked hard among you. You know how we labored in your behalf, working night and day." There was an example established there that took some time and consistency to establish. And in that same letter of 1 Thessalonians, Paul could urge the brethren to cooperate with their leaders. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verses 12 and 13, "We ask you, brothers, to respect those who labor among you and are over you in the Lord and admonish you, and to esteem them very highly in love because of their work," implying that the church had competent leadership, which must have taken more than a few weeks to accomplish. Also, in the letter that Paul wrote to the Philippian church several years later, he remembered how the Philippian church had helped him with support more than once during his stay in Thessalonica, which again must have been at least some months in duration. Philippians chapter 4, verse 16, "Even in Thessalonica you sent me help for my needs once and again." More than once, the church in Philippi sent financial assistance to Paul while Paul was in Thessalonica. So the time in Thessalonica was at least several months in duration. 3 weeks, 3 Sabbaths, teaching in the synagogue, and then some time after that. But after the initial 3 weeks, the 3 Sabbaths where they taught in the synagogue and reasoned from the scriptures, Acts 17:4, some of them were persuaded. Some of the Jews in the synagogue were persuaded and joined Paul and Silas, as did a great many of the devout Greeks and not a few of the leading women. And this is the same kind of result we've seen in other places. This is very much like Antioch of Pisidia in Acts chapter 13. There was initial success in teaching in the synagogue, reasoning together. And some Jews were convinced by the reasoning from the scriptures and joined the preachers in following Jesus. The success was once again greater in Thessalonica as it had been in Antioch among the Greeks, who were like Cornelius in Acts chapter 10, devout students of the scriptures, no doubt engaging in prayers and alms as he did, but not wholly converted to Judaism. Quite a few devout Greeks, Luke tells us, and also a number of the important women in the community. The message of Christ offering the same hope to Jew and Gentile, the same salvation, the same Spirit, to men and women alike was apparently, for centuries, and sometimes some places still today, very attractive to women, more attractive to women than to men, in fact. In some generations, the number of women in the church has exceeded the number of men. Acts chapter 17, verse 5, "But the Jews were jealous, and taking some wicked men of the rabble, they formed a mob, set the city in an uproar, and attacked the house of Jason, seeking to bring them out to the crowd." So again, as in Antioch of Pisidia, the very success that the gospel had among the Greeks and leading women led to jealousy and hostile opposition from the Jewish community. This behavior of rabble-rousing and stirring an uproar in the city happened too often in those days in the Roman world, contributing to the prejudice against Jews as troublemakers that was mentioned at Philippi in Acts chapter 16, verse 20. This was not a tactic that had just been invented to persecute Christians. This is a tactic that had occurred on a number of occasions in a number of places. Jason was probably a Greek-speaking Jew who followed Paul and Silas and subsequently hosted them in his house, but he might have been one of the devout Greeks. Either way, since he had opened his home to the evangelists, he became a target of the hostility of the Jews there, and he became a target in the uproar that the jealous Jews had started there in Thessalonica. And so in verse 6, when they could not find them, they couldn't find Paul and Silas, don't know where they were, but they couldn't find them. So they dragged Jason and some brothers before the authorities, shouting that these men had turned the world upside down and have come here, and Jason has received them, and they're all acting against the decrees of Caesar, saying there is another King Jesus. Paul and Silas, the mob could not find, but Jason and some other believers were dragged before the city authorities. As in Philippi, the accusations made here in Thessalonica were intended to bring Roman wrath down on the Christians. The accusations were actually much like those that were leveled by the Jewish leaders in Jerusalem against Jesus himself when they called for his crucifixion, saying that he claimed to be a king and that they, the Jewish people, had no king but Caesar. That's in John chapter 18, verse 12, for one. This is highly ironic. It was when the Jews said that of Jesus, and it's highly ironic here as well, that Jews took that tactic, and here, after 20 years, are taking that tactic yet again, of accusing the Christians of treason against Caesar. Yet, about 15 years after this incident, we're in around 51 AD, and about 15 years after this incident, the Jews in Judea and in cities all over the Roman Empire erupted in rebellion against the Roman Caesar. As an historical and archaeological note, Luke here in verse 6 and verse 8 calls the city officials in Thessalonica politarchs, which means city rulers. This word is found nowhere else in Greek literature. However, in 1835, a Greek inscription with the term politarch was found on an arch that had spanned the Egnatian Way on the west side of the city of Thessalonica. Continued archaeological work in Macedonia has found numerous inscriptions with the same word for the city rulers. I mention that just to affirm that while this was lost to obscurity in ancient history, Luke once again was exactly right in his vocabulary in describing the local terminology, the local customs, local rulers that existed in the various places that the apostles went. Indeed, the accusation that was made against Paul and Silas here in Thessalonica, just like the accusation against Jesus that was brought before Pilate, had some merit. The Christians did say there's another king, a greater king, Jesus being greater than Caesar. But they were not acting against the decrees of Caesar, and they weren't stirring rebellion against Caesar, and they were not teaching people to disobey Caesar, except in the one matter of worshiping God alone, worshiping only one God. Notice that the implication here in the accusations made against them, these men have turned the world upside down. There were widespread rumors about the message of Christ and perhaps about the apostles themselves, the specific individuals. These men have turned the world upside down. They've come here. While Paul had reasoned in the synagogue, the troublemakers relied not on reason and persuasion, but on fear and prejudice and misrepresentation. The Jason who is mentioned here may or may not be the same man who is mentioned by Paul in Romans chapter 16, verse 21, who was described as a relative and at that time was with Paul in Corinth. While we don't know much about this Jason, who became the center of the uproar in Thessalonica, was sucked into that confusion, we can be reasonably sure that Luke knew him personally, though Luke was at this time in Philippi when all of this is happening, and the churches at Philippi and Thessalonica were 100 miles apart. But again, as mentioned in Philippians chapter 4, verse 16, there was communication between Paul and the Philippian church during this period of time. In Acts chapter 17, verse 8, the people and the city officials, the city authorities, were disturbed when they heard these things, the accusations that were raised of them being troublemakers and teaching that there's another king besides Caesar. And when they had taken money as security from Jason and the rest, they let them go. The money was a bond posted as a guarantee that Jason and his associates wouldn't disturb the peace of the community. Of course, they hadn't disturbed the peace in the first place. But they posted bond in order to be released. And the threat against Jason and these other believers by the disturbed authorities was a dire threat. Failure to post the bond and subsequently keep the peace could have resulted in the confiscation of the property and could have resulted, in fact, even in death if they were considered to be genuinely guilty of civil disobedience. When Paul wrote 1 Thessalonians, along with Silas and Timothy, he referred several times to these troubles at that time when they were personally there in Thessalonica. As, for example, in 1 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 6, you received the word in much affliction. And again in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 2, although we had already suffered and been shamefully treated at Philippi, as you know, we had boldness in our God to declare to you the gospel of God in the midst of much conflict. So Paul, Silas, and Timothy in these passages, and again in 1 Thessalonians 2:14, you, brothers, became imitators of the churches of God in Christ Jesus that are in Judea, for you suffered the same things from your own countrymen that they did from the Jews. The circumstances that we're reading very briefly about of the tumult in Thessalonica made a big impression, of course. The hostility leveled against the preachers and against the church was something that was quite noteworthy and memorable. And as far as Paul was concerned, Paul, Silas, and Timothy, in writing to the church at Thessalonica, commendable on their part that they put up with that they came to terms with the persecution and remained steadfast in the midst of that pressure and that conflict. Acts chapter 17, verses 10 through 15, reading again from the English Standard Version. The brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away by night to Berea, and when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. Now these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Many of them therefore believed, with not a few Greek women of high standing as well as men. But when the Jews from Thessalonica learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, they came there too, agitating and stirring up the crowds. Then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea, but Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving a command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. So the brothers immediately sent Paul and Silas away. After the uproar had ended and Jason had posted bond, Paul and Silas, whom the agitators had been searching for and not found, Paul and Silas were sent away by night to Berea. This is like Paul going over the wall in the basket in Damascus 15 years or so earlier than this. And when they arrived, they went into the Jewish synagogue. So Paul and Silas, in secrecy, in the dark of night, left Thessalonica and went down the road to Berea. Once again, Timothy is not mentioned as a participant in this event. He may have been back with Luke in Philippi when this broke loose, or he may have already come to Thessalonica but was not one of those targeted by the mob. The persecution in Thessalonica, though briefly described, was deadly serious and very dangerous. Paul was not easily bluffed out, but we have seen a number of instances where the only option he had was to leave town, and that became true in Thessalonica. So once again, Paul and Silas and Timothy, although he's not mentioned here by name, went on to Berea, traveling at night to avoid stirring up more trouble in Thessalonica. Berea is about 50 miles from Thessalonica, so they went a good ways down the road. And despite the trouble that some of the Jews in Thessalonica had provoked, the first place Paul and Silas went to preach in Berea once again was the synagogue. Even with the hostility that often arose in the synagogues, there were usually some Jewish converts, and some of those men would often become the first leaders of these young churches when the apostles moved on to other work. In Acts 17:11, these Jews were more noble than those in Thessalonica, the Jews of the synagogue in Berea. They received the word with all eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. Now, there had been some success among the Jews of Thessalonica, but apparently there was much more success among the Jews in Berea. To their credit, the Jews of Berea, they investigated the scriptures to verify what Paul and Silas taught. We were told that Paul reasoned from the scriptures in Thessalonica, but then some of the Jews there became unreasonable and stubborn. But these Jews were carefully examining to see whether the prophecies worked as Paul was explaining. They received the word eagerly. This was a message that was welcomed to them. Studies were taking place daily. They were examining the scriptures daily to see if these things were so. The testimony of the scriptures was persuasive, and many of them believed. This time again, there were a number of prominent women in the community, non-Jews, who believed along with the uncircumcised men who were attached to the synagogue and students of the scriptures. The church in Berea was off to a grand start in that community, and as will always be the case, when people honestly look for the truth and carefully consider the evidence. To this day, the story of the scriptures stands on good evidence, and honest consideration will lead to belief. In Acts 17:13, but the Jews from Thessalonica, 50 miles away, but rumors of what was happening in Berea came to Thessalonica. They learned that the word of God was proclaimed by Paul at Berea also, so they came there, agitating and stirring up the crowds. As had happened in Lystra, back in Acts chapter 14, verse 19, news of the preacher's success passed along their back trail, where they had enemies. At that time, in Lystra, it was Jews from Antioch of Pisidia and from Iconium who traveled to Lystra to stir up mob violence against Paul, and on that occasion he had been stoned. This time it was Jews from Thessalonica who had been jealous and stirred mob violence in Thessalonica, and now they heard what was happening in Berea, and so they traveled there to again agitate the crowds against the preachers. In Acts 17:14, then the brothers immediately sent Paul off on his way to the sea. But Silas and Timothy remained there. Those who conducted Paul brought him as far as Athens, and after receiving command for Silas and Timothy to come to him as soon as possible, they departed. While Timothy may have remained for a time with Luke in Philippi, and then may have traveled back and forth between Philippi and Thessalonica, by this time he had been with Paul and Silas in Berea, and he stayed there with Silas while Paul left town on account of the violence that was directed against the church because of hostility specifically against him, the one who did the most talking, as had been the case back in Acts 14. So Paul went on his way to the sea with an escort of brothers from Berea. Berea was, again, about 50 miles from Thessalonica. It was also about 20 miles inland in a somewhat mountainous region of northern Greece there, Macedonia. And then, having traveled to the sea, he traveled southward with brethren and company went with him. And they may have walked all the way from Berea to Athens, or it may be that when they came to the coast that they caught a ship and went by ship. It was going to be a walking journey of about 99 miles, so it would have taken a few days to make that walk, if indeed they walked that way. But Luke doesn't explicitly tell us the mode of transportation once they came to the sea, either walking or taking a ship that would have gone along the coast. While Paul left promptly to calm the situation in Berea, Silas and Timothy could remain in Berea and make a more orderly exit for the sake of the young church there. By the time Paul had reached Athens, he had a plan that included Silas and Timothy joining him as soon as possible. That proved to actually be a while. They didn't come right away. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 17 through chapter 3, verse 5, Paul, Silas, and Timothy wrote about the decision for Paul to remain alone in Athens. What is described here is also described there. 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, 17, and into the beginning of chapter 3. The decision for Paul to remain alone at Athens, even though he greatly desired to return to Thessalonica, that's mentioned in the Thessalonian letter. He wanted to go back to Thessalonica, but Satan prevented him from doing so. And Satan was acting through the hostility of these Jews who had come from Thessalonica to Berea, and perhaps other factors that we don't have specifically mentioned. So the choice was made, and that choice is described again in 1 Thessalonians chapters 2 and 3, to send Timothy from Berea to Thessalonica while Paul was in Athens and while Silas continued in Berea, so that Timothy could see how the church was doing and offer the church in Thessalonica some encouragement. However, as we'll see in Acts chapter 18, Silas and Timothy did not catch up with Paul in Athens as he hoped, but instead they found him even further down the road in Corinth. So for some time, Paul's team of 4 co-workers traveling together, Luke, Silas, Timothy, and Paul himself, this team of 4 co-workers traveling together who had gone from Troas to Macedonia was divided into 4 different parts, with Luke in Philippi, with Timothy in Thessalonica, with Silas in Berea, and with Paul in Athens. And that's where we'll pick up the story in our next video, Acts chapter 17, verse 16, with Paul alone in Athens.